15 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few wide receivers I would bench this week. The first guy, Corwin Sutton of the Denver Broncos. So I don't know what the deal's been with Sutton here over the last few weeks. He got that big contract extension early in the season, and the last 6 weeks here, this guy's been non-existent for fantasy owners of the Broncos. Week 12 versus the Chargers, 2 catches, 17 yards. Week 13 at Kansas City, 2 catches, 15 yards. And Week 14 in a great matchup versus Detroit, 1 catch for 9 yards. So right here in Week 15, decent matchup on paper versus Cincinnati. That gives up the 15th most fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. But after what I've been seeing here from Sutton, he hasn't reached double-digit fantasy points going back all the way to Week 7. So there's no way in a playoff game as a fantasy owner I would start him. And let's be honest, this season he's been a fantasy bust. So right here, he's an easy wide receiver to bench this week with no track record and him just not doing anything. The next wide receiver is Terry McLaurin of the Washington football team. So far early in the week here, he hasn't practiced with a concussion issue. And even before that, he's been not putting up numbers the last 3 weeks here. McLaurin. Week 12 versus Seattle, 4 catches, 51 yards. Week 13 at Vegas, in that one, 3 catches, 22 yards. And then Week 14 versus the Dallas Cowboys, he had a goose egg in that one. And he didn't get hurt until the late second quarter in that ball game where he had a mid-air collision on a 50-50 ball. And he came down and hit the back of his head on the turf. So right here was a bad fall. And this week's a bad matchup at Philly as well. That gives up the second least amount of fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. And right now, we don't know who the quarterback's going to be this week. Taylor Heineke, he took a beating in that ball game versus the Cowboys. He's questionable. And backup quarterback Kyle Allen went on the COVID list. So right here, Terry McLaurin, with all those factors against him, and him possibly not even playing anyway with a concussion, I would go better off just benching him this week, and hopefully he comes back healthy next week and can contribute to your fantasy team, because he's risky either way, in my opinion. The next wide receiver is Hollywood Brown of the Baltimore Ravens. So Hollywood Brown, he got off to a hot start the first 6 weeks of the season, but he really fizzled out over the last 5-6 weeks of the year. Week 12 versus Cleveland, 8 catches, 51 yards. Week 13 at Pittsburgh, 5 catches, 55 yards. And then last week at Cleveland in Week 14, 5 catches, 41 yards. So right here, Week 15, mediocre matchup versus the Green Bay Packers that give up the 18th most fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. But right here, Lamar Jackson, we don't know if he's going to play. Huntley, decent quarterback, but not really accurate. And he missed Brown on a few deep balls last week. So right here, with all those factors against him as well, with his numbers going down over the last 6 weeks of the season, and him not really making an impact unless he's going to catch a deep ball and take it to the house, right here, it's tough to trust Hollywood Brown this week. And I would bench him if I have better options. The next wide receiver is Julio Jones of the Tennessee Titans. So Julio Jones, at this point of his career, it's hard to say, but he's just a name at this point for fantasy football, is Julio Jones. This season, he missed tons of ball games, 7 games with a hamstring and a knee injury. And he returned last week in a plus matchup versus Jacksonville and only had 4 catches, 33 yards. So right here, Week 15, it's a good matchup at Pittsburgh, who gives up the 13th most fantasy points to receivers. But Ryan Tannehill, he hasn't been in sync really with Julio. On the season as a whole, Julio only has 1 double-digit fantasy day in the 8 games he's played this year. So right now, that's not getting the job done. Confidence at all when I own Julio in a league. And I'm just not going to play him this week, because the most he's going to get is maybe 10, 12 points. Absolutely, he could have a big game, but I just don't see it. And even if he does, I can't trust it as being a consistent thing. So right here, Tennessee, they've been trying to win ball games over the last few weeks with not many pass attempts, more defense, and a running committee back there. So right here, Julio Jones at Pittsburgh, I just don't see him doing much. But if he does, good for him. But this week, I'm benching him either way, unless you got no other options. But right now, he's been a bust for sure this season. And the 5th and final wide receiver I would bench is another guy who's been banged up this year and been a bust this year, Kenny Gaviday of the New York Giants. So he signed a huge 1-year deal for, I think, 14 or 15 million in the offseason here is Gaviday. But this is another guy who's failed to reach double-digit fantasy points since week 4 of the season, and somehow he's still owned in 51% of fantasy leagues. I know he's got a decent matchup on paper versus the Dallas Cowboys, but he's a total gamble in my opinion to roll the dice and start him. So the last few games here for Gaviday, week 12 versus the Eagles, 3 catches, 50 yards. Week 13 in Miami, 3 catches, 37 yards. And then week 14 at the Chargers, he did have 8 targets, but 2 catches, 15 yards. And the other thing here, we don't know who's going to quarterback. Daniel Jones, he's banged up with the neck strain and some leg issues. Mike Glennon, he had a concussion a couple weeks ago, but he did play last week versus the Chargers, and he really had no impact. And now there's talk that Jake Fromm might get some snaps in this game. So over there with their offensive line, obviously, and quarterback carousel, it looks like over there in New York, you just can't trust really anyone on this offense besides maybe Saquon Barkley, who I think does have a decent game versus Dallas this week. But Kenny Galladay, I can't trust him. Quarterbacks over there, it's a mess in New York. And right now, he's an easy receiver to bench this week. So that's a few wide receivers I will bench for week 15 of the fantasy football season.